All right, so in the last lesson, we learned everything we need to know about creating windows within the color tab. But most of the time, windows are going to be pointless to us if they're not tracked to anything within our scene. In this case, if I scrub through, we can see this window doesn't follow anything and it would be kind of pointless, right? And that's where the tracker comes into play, which is the next button over here. If we click on it, we are presented with the tracker interface over here. And this is one of those major reasons that a lot of people were switching over to DaVinci for color grading. Because the tracker is so good, you're able to very quickly and easily make selections to any part of your image. And by doing so, you're able to manipulate the colors of very specific areas. Now, the tracker within the color tab is capable of doing much more than just tracking windows. We have two other interfaces over here. We got stabilizer and we also have effects. Now I'm going to leave those for a separate video. In this video, we're only going to be talking about using the tracker to track our windows. Now over here to the top left of the tracker, we have a bunch of different buttons. The first button is to track one frame reverse. Then we have track reverse, we have stop tracking, we have track forwards and reverse, we have track forwards, and we have track one frame forward. So most of the time when I come in here, I'm just going to use this button here in the middle, track forward and reverse. This is actually a new feature. Before, what we had to do was track forwards from whatever frame we start on, then go back to that frame and track backwards. So it's really nice that we have this new option here to just press one button and it automatically goes forwards and then backwards. Because the thing is, most of the time you're not going to be starting your tracking at the end or the start of your clip, because the best place to start is wherever your subject is the most visible. So in this case, in this clip, this wouldn't be the best place to start. I feel like it would probably still do a good job, but I started later on here where we can see the most surface area on the mask here. You want to find the best frame within your clip that will have the most information of whatever it is that you're trying to track. So in this case, this is a great frame to start with. So by default, we're going to have all of these checkboxes turned on. So essentially what we're doing here with these checkboxes is we are telling the tracker what transforms we want applied to our window automatically after we've tracked. So if I just have one of these checked off, so let's just have pan selected and let's track forwards and backwards. So we can see that the window didn't follow the goggles within the shot. All it did was follow the pan motion of the goggles. So it did track the goggles, but it only applied the pan information from that track to our window. So this is just to demonstrate what's going on. I'm going to hit Command Z over here. Let's go back to our point right here. I'm going to reset this curve. I'll always start with all of these just checked on. And if I don't like what it's doing to my window, then I'll experiment with unchecking some of these. So with all of these selected, let's hit track forwards and reverse and see what happens. So notice how there's a bunch of these points over here. That's called the point cloud. And you can see with all of those selected, it did a really, really good job at following those goggles. It looks really good. Even though my head turns here and things are going off axis, it did a great job at tracking those goggles. So one thing I want you to take note of is once we've actually created the tracking data for our window, we can see that we have this little icon on our node right here. And that just tells us that there is tracking information applied to our window. And we can also see these 4 lines within our tracker. Each one is a different color. And each one of these lines is just a visual representation of the tracking data that we've gathered from our track. Now, if at any point your track didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, you can just go up here to the top right of the tracker panel and just reset it. You can go back to the frame that you started at, or you could try a completely different frame, and change up your mask completely, and then you can try it again. But in this case, it worked perfectly, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. So the next thing I'm going to share with you guys is very important for you to understand. So if I take my window over here and I move it over, what do you think is happening? Well, you would think that the tracking data has created an animation path for our window, and it has. And by moving it over here, you might think that we've messed up our animation path. But if we scrub through here, let's see what happens. We can see that that mask stays locked on. It's just in a new position. It's following the exact same motion. We didn't actually mess anything up. And that's something that's really important to understand. When we are in the clip option here, we can do these kind of changes. So once our window is already tracked to our footage, we can play around with it. We can even change the shape of it. We could scale it up, rotate it, do whatever we want, and it's going to stay locked on with that same tracking information. This is really awesome because in some situations, you're not going to get a good track by tracking the entire thing that you're trying to track. Maybe there's not enough contrast points or details for the tracker to work properly. So in those situations, what you can do is actually track a smaller portion of whatever it is that you're trying to track. And then that way you'll have accurate tracking data. Then afterwards, you can expand your window to whatever shape or size you want. So I'm just going to undo this to get back to our original window here. So when we move our window around in our preview over here in clip view, it doesn't change any of the tracking data at all. If we start making changes to our window in frame mode, it will disrupt the original tracking data. So this can be useful in a lot of situations where maybe your window didn't track properly for a certain amount of frames. So you can just manually go in there and fix it yourself. So I want you guys to watch the timeline down here in the tracker. And if I make an adjustment here on this frame, watch what happens. It created a new keyframe. So it's now recording the change of the tracking data at this point in time. I'm basically creating a new keyframe for the position and the shape of the window at this point in time. And therefore I am changing the tracking data. And this is awesome because you can see I've kind of refined the window to better fit the glass of the goggles, and the rest of the tracking data stays the same. I've kind of just like optimized it for the points that need a bit of optimization. So maybe over here, we can zoom in. We could probably make this a little bit better. We can see it's kind of slipping here. So what I can do is move this over and notice how it's made a keyframe at this point here as well to record these changes that we're making. And now let's see if that translates for the rest of the clip here. We can see it starts to slide a little bit over here too. So let's go to the first keyframe here and let's modify that one. So we can just move this whole thing over actually. Something like that. Awesome. So if I scrub through, we can see it's now doing a much better job at that starting point. And this looks pretty good to me. I feel good about that. So that's really important for us to understand. The way that we interact with our window in the clip mode versus the frame mode is very different. Frame mode will actually record the changes and affect the tracking data, whereas in clip mode, we're able to freely move our window and not worry about affecting our tracking data. So now that we have a really solid track around these goggles, we can make any changes that we want to our second node over here, and it will only affect whatever is inside of our window over here. So let's go to our curves. Let's bump it up. Let's brighten that up. That looks good. And that looks very realistic. It looks like we actually have a lot more light coming into the goggles here, when in reality, it was actually looking like that. It was much darker. So we've managed to bring back a lot of the information from inside of the goggles. We can see my eyes here, which were pretty hidden before. So this is a bit more of a tasteful change. But of course, we can do anything that we want now. We can change the temperature of this. We can go crazy, play around with different effects. And it looks pretty good. I'm stoked on how well this was able to track the goggles. So I'm going to go back to my tracker over here. So we can reset up here in the top right, and it clears all of our tracking data. I'm going to move forwards so that our window is in the right spot. Now down here, we can see there's this little drop down. We can choose Cloud Tracker or Point Tracker. Now by default, it's set to Cloud Tracker. And what we saw when it was tracking was a bunch of different points within our window. And all of those points are just showing us what specific points in our image is the tracker going to use to actually get tracking data from. So if I go over here to the bottom left and I turn on interactive mode, then we'll be able to see that point cloud over here. So these are all the individual points that the tracker is going to use to get tracking information for this window. Now, let's say that maybe we had a bunch of different things happening within this window that we don't want to be pulling information from. So let's say maybe this was a lot brighter and my eyes were moving all over the place. And because we have, a moving object within the object that we are wanting to get tracking data from, that could mess up our track. So for this reason, the tracker has something called the point tracker. And this basically allows us to select specific points within our window to pull tracking data from. So in this case, I wouldn't use the point tracker, but I'm just going to demonstrate how it works. So down here to the left, we have this button here, and it will allow us to add a tracker point. Once we do that, we can see it's this little crosshair right here. Then we can click and drag it, move it to anywhere that we want within our window. So maybe something like this little dot, this little speck on the goggles itself. Maybe this one down here because it's more brighter. It might be able to pick that up a little bit easier. And we can just continuously add these. So by clicking this button here in the bottom left, we can add as many of these as we want. So we can manually go in and choose what points we want to use to get tracking information from. Now in this case, I wouldn't say that this is a smart method to pull tracking data from this scene, especially because the point cloud did such a good job. And that's the thing, I would always start with the point cloud, just see how it does, because it is the fastest option. And if that just doesn't work, then you can go this route. So let's add one more here. Let's add one to maybe like here. And in order for us to get like a good track here, we're gonna have to add a bunch of points. And you can see how much more time consuming this is. Now I'm not gonna do that, but why don't we just track what we have here so far just for fun, just to see what happens. Okay, so it did a decent job when the goggles are facing straight forward in front of the camera. It's not too bad. But then it like freaks out there because of those bubbles that come into the frame. And that's the thing, when we're using the point cloud, it's able to, average out all of the points within here, and the track wouldn't be as affected by occlusions entering our window over here. So an occlusion is whatever is between the camera and the subject that you're trying to track. So in this case, these bubbles are occlusions. And because we have so minimal tracking points, these are heavily affecting our track. So I'm just gonna reset this. And I want to show you guys a different way that we can interact with the point cloud. So let's go back to the cloud tracker over here and notice that interactive mode is enabled, right? By default, it is not enabled. So if we turn it on, it is enabled. And we can see that we have our point cloud here. We can see all the points that it's going to be referencing to get tracking data from. Now, because we've enabled interactive mode, we can interact with like the default point cloud that it's made here. So with interactive mode enabled, we have some buttons over here that allow us to modify the point cloud over here. So with the first button here, what I can do is draw a little box anywhere within my window here. So let's say I wanted to add more points to this area. What I could do is draw a little box, and then down here, I can click this button, insert, and it's going to insert points within that little box that I just made. So now we have more tracking points that we can pull data from. And I can do this to any part of my window. I can go down here if I want to add more tracking points, create that box, click insert, and it's going to insert more tracking points to where it thinks that it can actually latch on within that space that I drew here. And if there's a section where I think the tracking points are not going to do too well, for example, maybe this bottom section over here, because later on we have bubbles like flying into that area, what I can do is draw that same kind of bounding box like this and go down here and select delete. And it's going to delete all the points within that box that I just drew. So this is just another way for us to interact with the tracker itself and maybe lead it in the right direction. If it's latching on to certain points that we know might cause it issues later on, we can just delete them, or we can add some more points to places that we know are going to work well for a track. So why don't we press the track forward and reverse button and see how good of a job it does here. So we can see some of those tracking points actually followed my eyes at one point. We can see them moving as I blink. Right over, where is it? Right there. So that is an example of where we would want to draw that bounding box and delete some of those points, because that is not helping with our overall track. We really just want to track the hard shape of the goggles, and that is something that is moving that isn't part of the goggles. It's something behind it and would interfere with the mask in a lot of different situations. But in this case, it didn't really mess with it that much. But that's a great example of where we would want to delete some points and not pull tracking information from. So in this case, we can see it wasn't a great idea for me to mess with that point cloud because it actually did a worse job than what we had before. This is a lot more skewed. It's not as attached as it was on there the first time. Now, coming from After Effects, I'm used to seeing the animation path of my mask or window. And the way that we can enable that here is to go to the three dots in the top right and select Show Track. And that is going to show you the animation path of your window. So if I grab my playhead and I scrub through here, we can see the path and we can see the point at which we're on along that path, represented by this one little square right here. And one last thing I want you guys to know is if you want to delete one of these keyframes on your timeline in here, you can't just select it and delete it. That doesn't work. What you're going to have to do is go up here to the three dots and select delete keyframe, and it's going to delete just that one individual keyframe that the playhead is on. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.